Thank you so much. 2 seconds for the putting the slides on. Everybody sees that? Aaron, are we good? Lovely. Good. So on behalf of Matt Sosnov, who cannot be here, and myself, thank you so much for the organizers, Christina and Shira, and thank you so much for our kind host, Aaron Mayer. It's absolutely fantastic to see so many distinguished scholars in the audience. I'm a bit thrilled and afraid at the same time, and it's great. We're about to speak about very quickly about 3 eras of cultic practices during the transition between the long periods of both EB and IB, and then the MB. While in the EB1 to 3, we have broad room temples. I put question mark there because there's so many that we don't know about the actual function of these. No cultic iconography, no objects that are foci of cult. Then you have in the intermediate Bronze Age, EB4 to intermediate Bronze Age, you have the rise of Megaron or in antis long room temples. And at the same time, you have Masevot as foci of cults first appearing, but still no cultic iconography. You'll see that a lot of themes are repeating from previous lectures, but happily, Matt was merciful and did not change the chronology of Megiddo, so that saved me some years of my life. And then at last you have the MB1 to 3, which is the long room temples. They do continuation of the in antis temples and Matzevot in either separate or unified context. And this is the so-called iconographic explosion, first appearance of metal figurines and other forms of iconography related to cult. First era is most interesting because you have this long sequence beginning Chalcolithic going all the way to EB4, 3 that are broad room temples. And I'm really interested to hear what they can be used for because, of course, I'm quoting all the doubts raised already by Gens and others um, about the actual function because you don't see a unified focal point. You have, as in Megiddo, you have numerous focal points in the forms of this beautiful basalt surfaces. And there's no doubt that this is incredibly important place, even on a super regional scale, which is connected with large scale meat preparation and as suggested as one of the possibilities for dining or banqueting. And here you can see of course, the parallels to it from various sides. This is the first era, and immediately after there seems to be some form of a break, which is, and then this is the question, when do you want to start this phenomenon of EB3 or EB4/IB long room or in antis or megaron temples? You choose whatever you like, but I tend to believe, tend to agree that this is indeed happening in the intermediate Bronze Age with all the necessary modification. We have to say, we have to think about the nature of IB in the southern Levant, which IB begins to be something incredibly important and much more connected to the northern Syrian or Syro-Mesopotamian sphere. And indeed, you see the triple temple before shown and explained so eloquently by Matt of the intermediate Bronze Age. And what I would like to say that this is also a first. That is, you have 3 of these, and therefore you may hypothesize about it, as was of course said before, about the establishment of a pantheon, or at least a multiple deities that are working together and worship together as part of the same building plan, which is also a first. The shrinking of this assemblage in the later IB, and again, I accept what Matt was saying, that this is occurring in the later IB, but I would also like to say something even more. I would say that it continues into the earliest MB, and there's a possibility that this is occurring without too much problems. And indeed, the Naharia type, seven cup vessel is lovely. And I would say that the two bronze objects shown here, the Anatolian or Minoan bronze axe and the eye axe below, does indeed also belong very well in the later part of the IB as well as the early part of the MB. So I don't have any problems with this. Rather, it works very well with what we will try to present here. And indeed, as shown by numerous eminent scholars, there's no problem by showing the big tradition of the EB4 or IB, depends which part of the Levant or the northern Levant you're talking about. And you see there's two fantastic examples of in antis temples at Ebla, one of them from the early part of the EB4, one of them from the later part of the EB4. And there are, of course, numerous examples. So it is not a hard sell to make the same case for Megiddo. And indeed, when talking about other cases, and here we get into the incorporation of betials or standing stones of Matzevot into this in antis temples, we see the famous examples of El Rawada in Syria, and in which you see a lovely complex which includes both temple or a series of temples, some things that can be, I don't think that are standing stones because there are more things to put offerings or other things on top of them. Look at the level. Somebody was paying attention to put some level to make it level. But again, this is something which is something to be presented in front of this temple. And in the entrance to this complex, or rather at close to the entrance, there's this monumental enclosure in which you have this very, very large stone, now fallen, but before, but no doubt an object of cult, an aptly named betil by the excavators. And here you can see the relative chronology. I can say more things about the relative and absolute chronology as in all things, but to this talk, it's suffice to say that these all belong to the second half of the third millennium, exactly the period we are talking about. Most importantly, in all of these, you don't have what will appear later, which is a lot of cultic iconography. So the imagery, you still do not have imagery. You have this an iconic representation of the sacred or sublime that we will speak about its meaning later. Indeed, Ben Ami in his 2008 article was speaking about EB3 to IBA, extramural standing stones in a series of sites. Matt and I brought you some very nice old images of these at Adair, and a lot of them are in the Transjordan. In Adair, really a magnificent one, and in Babedra, and there used to be ones in Khirbet Iskander also, and in Lejeune and afterwards. I would not dwell on all this description of these early and magnificent explorers that have looked at these. And indeed, Ben Ami is arguing that the Gezer complex does belong to the IB. We do not absolutely buy that, but we think about this as a continuity of tradition. We'll speak about it later. Unfortunately or fortunately, outside Megiddo, you don't have too many cult places of the IB. It's possible that they are buried underneath other cult places of the MB or under alluvium of other places. But of course, everybody quotes the Tel Ashir one just opposite of Tel Poleg at the estuary, close to the estuary of Nahal Poleg, excavated by Gofna, which have an open air cult site with matzevot and taboons and cooking and a lot of ash. And it looks like this, and this is an open field with a row of matzevot, and of course what you expect to find around them. That is activity of cooking, of perhaps banqueting on a very, very small scale, but definitely belonging to the intermediate Bronze Age. This is a lovely example, I would say, of a cult place of a community that does not have to be immediately by a site. So we can imagine in the intermediate Bronze Age that you have such cult sites, rather vernacular, rather without large cultic architecture. That is, not every site is Megiddo, that is existing to every small community, and even communities that are semi-mobile throughout the year. The nature of the ceremony is, of course, an inclusive ceremony in which the entire community, because it's not enclosed, or if there is an enclosure wall, it's rather large, but you can have the entire community take part in it. And then you can see the lack of similarity between the stones. Every stone have a meaning. We'll try to understand and we'll try to decipher it later. Everybody loves the cult Kaiv at Kedesh, so we will mention it too. Plenty of caliciform, will not elaborate about it, was elaborated before. Probably some feasting. There is small cooking pots among these cultic finds. And most importantly, there is this pillar that may have been used as matzeva because the central hewn pillar does have a ledge that you can put some offering on it. It does look like somebody was making this sacred landscape inside the cave. The cave was not sufficient. You have to make it into some form of a sacred landscape by this small highland community of the Galilee. We get to the third era, and this is the in antis temples and matzevot are co-occurring, and you have the aniconic standing stones, foci of cult in the southern Levant, together with this large or sometimes small and sometimes larger temples in Antis, then therefore they develop afterwards to the Syrian temples. Here you can see the Tel Kitan one, which is great because you have this lovely example of an Antis temple of the NB1, and in front of it you see a row of matzevot and standing stones. All of them are uniconic apart from this one, which is semi-iconic. Okay, so you see how these things are beginning to reside together, and you see the difference between the enclosed and the open. Almost the same thing is happening at Tel El Hayat temple precinct in the Transjordan, in which you can see this beautiful Syrian style structure and these matzevot all around it, or around one of the corners, merging the, let's say, the official and perhaps the vernacular, although they are very well made. The obelisk temple at Byblos is unique by having Egyptian influence obelisk, and at the same time you have Biblian anchors of the MB1 used also as matzevot, probably as ex-votos. And at the end, you have the high place of Gezer. Diva would like it to be MB3. I'm not convinced it is not MB3, but please look at the difference in sizes and in shapes of the stones. It's possible that each of them reflect a different event and commemorate something different. It's so interesting that after monumental structures at Megiddo and the MB1 and 2, you have a new cultic place, which is inside and by this monumental palace that is being built in 12, you have these very, very small vernacular, even personal field of matzevot that are really important. And notice the difference between this monumental and organized and this small field that does continue. I would agree with Matt that it does continue previous IB traditions well into the MB, and indeed you see here something that is maybe an inclusive place of worship. However, another thing is happening with the internationalization of the MB, which is the appearance or the appearance of iconography and especially metal figurines that brings for the first time the notion that people are interacting with anthropomorphic deities, both female and male, probably creating pantheons. There are numerous styles of them found at Megiddo, cultic place, some of them all the way to the late Bronze Age, and of course at Hatzor, various areas on the Acropolis and in Gezer, and at Byblos, hundreds of them in the Temple of the Obelisk as part of dedications. Nahariya is something lovely. Nahariya, you have a small cultic place that's connected with the polity of Kabri, or that's what would you like to see that, beginning to operate in the MB1. And then you have also a structure by it. The structure itself has some form of a bama close to it, or some form of a ramp, and another place in which perhaps you have stelae, and there are several phases of this, still awaiting final publication. The lovely occurrence of these 7 cup vessels, so nicely interpreted by Liat Naeh to be symbolism connected with perhaps the goddess Ishtar, and the number 7, I totally buy into it, is accompanied by a very, very large number of metal figurines. Each of them is distinctively different from the other in modes of production and in style and even in the metal, indicating that probably close to this coastal shrine, or that also is on top of a road going from the north to south, you have new influences and new ways to think and to interact with the deities that are impacted by more Mediterranean areas. You can see that. Another thing which is happening in Nahariya is, of course, activities of cooking, which occurs outside, which does show a continuation with the IB. Just mentioning the same phenomenon at Hatzor, later that by this huge complex, you have the very, very vernacular field of small matzevot, very personal, confronted by the very monumental. Of course, in Syria and of course in Hatzor, you have matzevot that are iconic, but this is a phenomenon which is rare outside Hatzor. What are we thinking about matzevot? And in the last 8 minutes of my talk, I will speak about it and summarize. The texts from the Bronze Age are rather in agreement that you have etymology, naked in sikanu, sakanu in Ugaritic, meaning to reside or to dwell or to place or to erect. And these stones are being used in the feast of Ishtar and Dagan, and in Emar, in various sacrificial rites, and in Ugarit, it is connected to deceased ancestor. And in the Hittite sphere, these are the massive Huwashi sacred stones that can be either a smaller stone or even a complex. I will not speak about all these parallels in archaeology, but very briefly talk about the sample of this text. Thus say from Mari, this is a text from the first half of the 18th century. Because of the festival for my lord Ishtar, I wrote. That festival is near, yet the stele is not available. The shikanum is not. Send 100 workmen and a reliable man who knows how to make a cult stele. Okay, so this festival, you need a very, very, very large stele, okay, and very well cut. Another one is saying on the 6th day of the month in Mari, 7 sheep were sacrificed at the temple of Dagan. One was for Dagan, the others were for the cult stele. And from Ugarit, later, of course, 13th century BCE, he who sets the Shikanu for his father god in the sanctuary, a holy incense stand in the shrine of his family. So we see how these stones are connected with sacrifice, commemoration, kinship. Of course, in Greek and in later Iron Age and later tradition, these are connected with a various of uses like border stones, stelae that are dedicatory. And of course, we get from Philo of Byblos the term betilus, which is of course of Semitic origin, the house of the god, stone endowed with life, which means that they are connected with a presence which is inside them. And Hesiod is speaking about stones in sanctuaries as commemorative for an event, and the same is done by Heracles, who is putting these 2 major stelae on both sides of the Mediterranean in its entrance, its exit to the Atlantic Ocean, or in Goddess Gadara in his temple. So, how to summarize all these things? I would say, or we would say very cautiously, that we were sure before beginning to work on this lecture that the birth of the true Canaanite cult, I don't know what true Canaanite cult is, but most of what we think as a Canaanite cult does begin in the MB1. Rather, now we would like to think about the birth of most critical elements of Canaanite cult, rather in the intermediate Bronze Age. And we are talking about the in antis temples and the contemporary use of standing stones. Temples in antis do begin in the IB, continue in the MB. There is probably a continuity in Megiddo. That's great. We need better evidence to fix the chronology, and one more clean locus apart from locus 4009 will do the trick. I'm sure Matt will find it. Kadesh and Ashir sites do emphasize the rural and natural landscapes of the local microregion, and they're becoming an integral part of the religious landscape. That is, Kadesh Cave inside the mountain, Tel Ashir on a hill opposing the sea. So we have places that are deeply connected to the landscape. And Kadesh and Ashir sites do demonstrate through the IB aniconic tendencies, communal activities, and matzevot, inclusive rather than exclusive cult. While open cult places with matzevot seems to be almost in competing tradition within antis temples in the MB. First, you have them in the IB at Megiddo, then you have an open field with stelae in the earliest MB, then and again in Megiddo, you have a large so-called Syrian temple. Should we think about dual way of thinking of exclusive practices, formal versus vernacular? One thing that you do with the stelae, another thing you do with the temples in Antis. And how would we place the iconography? Are the stelae connected with the iconography of deities that is beginning to proliferate in the MB1? Or, as I would think, and as Matt and I would think, that you have this long-rooted, aniconic tradition that do continue from the IB into the MB, which is in stark dichotomy to this imagery, which also appears in the IB. So much to do, and I thank you for your attention.
Asaf, thank you very much.